Have it.
Mr. Speaker, I would ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey will be postponed. What purpose does the gentleman from Puerto Rico rise?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk that was printed in the congressional record as amendment number 12.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 12, printed in the congressional record, offered by Mr. Pierre Luisi of Puerto Rico.
Gentleman from Puerto Rico is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I offered this amendment last year, and it was adopted by voice vote. However, it was not included in the final Consolidation Appropriations Act enacted in March. The homicide rate in Puerto Rico is about 3 times higher than any state, and most of these murders are linked to the international drug trade. Appropriately, the federal government is allocating substantial resources to combat drug trafficking organizations operating in the Central American corridor and along the southwest border. However, those organizations are adapting, returning to smuggling routes through the Caribbean region that were heavily utilized in the 1980s and 1990s. As a result, the Coast Guard seized or disrupted over 17,000 pounds of drugs in the vicinity of Puerto Rico in 2012, a 600% increase over the previous year. DEA seizures rose nearly 100%. Customs seizures were up nearly 40%. And in 2012, Customs seized more drugs in Puerto Rico than it did along the 180-mile border between Mexico and New Mexico. Meanwhile, the street price of drugs in Puerto Rico has decreased. This is a security problem of national scope, given that 80% of the drugs that enter Puerto Rico are subsequently transported to the U.S. mainland, where they destroy communities and lives. Through various bills and accompanying reports, the House Appropriations Committee has expressed the view that DHS and DOJ should prioritize counter-drug efforts in the U.S. Caribbean to respond to the current crisis. As a case in point, the report for the 2013 DHS Appropriations Bill stated that the public safety and security issues of the U.S. territories in the Caribbean must be a priority, and that the committee expects the Secretary of Homeland Security to allocate resources, assets, and personnel to these jurisdictions accordingly. U.S. Customs and Border Protection is on the front lines of the counter-drug fight. The agency has hundreds of personnel stationed in Puerto Rico. My amendment is designed to address a problem that arose in fiscal year 2011, and one that continues to compromise the ability of CBP to carry out its vital counter-drug mission in Puerto Rico. For over a century, federal law has provided that the collection of certain duties and taxes in Puerto Rico by CBP or its predecessor agencies will be deposited in something called the Puerto Rico Trust Fund. Pursuant to the law and implementing agreement between the Puerto Rico government and the federal government, a significant portion of that money is also used to fund certain federal operations in Puerto Rico, including the maritime operations of CBP's Office of Air and Marine. For many years, this arrangement worked well enough. However, because of a shortfall in the Puerto Rico Trust Fund of $1.7 million due to reduced customs collections in fiscal year 2011, CBP closed a critical boat unit in San Juan that in 2010 had seized over 7,000 pounds of illegal drugs. CBP took this drastic action because it has interpreted current federal law to require that it use either the trust fund or general congressional appropriations to fund its operations, but not both. The amendment would simply give CBP the authority to supplement any funding from the trust fund with general appropriations made in this bill. This would make it easier for CBP to avoid any further reductions to its operations in Puerto Rico and ideally enable the agency to enhance those operations. The need for this amendment is underscored by the fact that the President's fiscal year 2014 budget predicts trust fund receipts of $98 million, which is $8 million less than an 8% reduction from the current trust fund receipts. I look forward to working with the chairman and the ranking member to ensure that this amendment, if adopted, remains in the final bill this year, and to continuing to work with them to ensure that the Department of Homeland Security, including CBP, has the resources it needs to adequately address the border protection challenges and drug-related violence in Puerto Rico. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman cannot reserve his time. The gentleman yields back his time.
I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. For the purpose of the gentleman from Texas rise.
Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I accept this amendment.
The gentleman yield back.
Yield back.
Gentleman from North Carolina.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last words.
The gentleman is recognized.
I, too, commend the gentleman for his amendment and urge its adoption. Yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Puerto Rico. As many as are in favor will signify by saying aye. Those opposed will say no. Opinion chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Amendment's agreed to. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York rise?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Graham of New York. At the end of the bill, before the short title, add the following section. None of the funds made available by this act may be used to implement any change in the list of sharp objects prohibited under Section 1540.111 of Title 49.
Chairman, I ask unanimous consent for the amendment to be considered read.
Is there objection? Without objection, the amendment is read. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise today in support of my amendment that would prohibit any funds made available by this act from being used by TSA to implement changes to the current list of prohibited carry-on items for air travel. Specifically, this amendment would stop TSA from allowing knives back on planes for the first time since the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. Today, following months of outrage from nearly every corner of the aviation community, and with our amendment looming tonight to block the policy, TSA abandoned its proposal to allow knives back on planes. I do commend TSA for reversing its irresponsible decision for one that is smart and prudent. However, we still need to pass this amendment tonight to make sure this is the law of the land and ensure that there will not be another reversal in the TSA's position regarding knives on planes. We live in a post-9/11 world, and there is no excuse to take liberties when it comes to public safety. As a former federal law enforcement agent, I know firsthand even a 2-inch knife can cause very serious harm when used by a trained individual. There's simply no place for a knife in an airplane cabin, and if one must travel with a knife, then they can check it in a bag. Over the last 2 months, my colleagues and I have heard from flight attendants, air marshals, pilots, TSA screeners, and a whole host of airlines who are all 100% in agreement that allowing knives to be brought into the cabin of passenger planes is dangerous. It's unnecessary and it's irresponsible. Further, we've heard a chorus of objections to TSA's misguided proposal from groups such as the Coalition of Flight Attendant Unions, Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association, Coalition of Airline Pilots Association, and American Federation of Government Employees, along with American Airlines, Delta Airlines, United Airlines, U.S. Airways, and most importantly, the American people. Their opposition makes it clear that permitting knives on planes creates unnecessary risk for airline passengers and those serving them at 30,000 feet. In advocating for this change, TSA Administrator Pistole has stated, and I quote, "There have been no attempts by terrorists to use a knife to commit a terrorist act aboard an aircraft since 9/11. Well, the way I see it, this should be a great indicator that the current policy is working and needs to be kept in place and not repealed. Simply stating that there haven't been any terrorist attacks with knives on planes since 9/11 does not mean that the terrorists won't carry them out in the future. I'd like to thank my co-sponsor of this amendment, Representatives Markey, Cook, Stallwell, Reed, Jackson Lee, Ross Leighton, Wasserman Schultz, who have stood in strong opposition to TSA's decision to jeopardize America's security. I thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from California rise?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, as the gentleman from New York pointed out, over the last 11 years, we have had 0 attacks on our airlines where a knife was involved. 0 attacks. That number cannot get better. However, as we saw on September 11th, that number tragically can get much worse. And so I rise in support of the Grimm, Markey, Cook, Swalwell, Reed, Jackson-Lee amendment, which would prevent the Transportation Security Administration from changing its prohibited item list, also known as the PIL, and allowing small knives on airplanes. I want to thank the amendment's co-sponsors for their hard work on this issue. I also want to thank TSA Administrator John Pistol. Administrator Pistol announced today that the TSA will not allow knives on airplanes. I think this is a strong step forward, and after listening to the stakeholders, his position is now that these knives should not be on airplanes. Like many Americans in our country, I was very deeply concerned and confounded when the administrator announced that they would consider allowing knives on airplanes. We saw after September 11th that, as my friend from New York mentioned, 0 attacks occurred in our country. We do now have new threats. The threat from liquids or IEDs could seriously jeopardize the safety of airlines and the passengers who ride on them. However, just because we have new threats that are posed against our airline safety does not mean that we should no longer consider old threats. The TSA must learn how to walk and chew gum at the same time. And so I was proud to work with my friend from New York to organize a letter along with Congressman Thompson, our ranking member on Homeland Security, and objected to that policy, in particular the failure of the TSA to consult with the key stakeholders who would be most affected by this change, such as flight attendants, passenger safety groups, transportation screening officers as well. The letter had a total of 133 members signing on to it. Congressman Grimm and Markey also organized a subsequent letter with a similar number of members who signed on to it. Just like my friend from New York, I also worked in law enforcement prior to coming to Congress. I worked as a local deputy district attorney in the district attorney's office in Alameda County. I also served under this Capitol dome as an intern when September 11th happened. I know what terrorists can do if they have a mission to hurt passengers. I also know as a prosecutor what a knife can do in a close, confined area. It's not difficult then to understand why so many members chose to sign on to our letter. And TSA's mission, I want to remind the people of this body, is not only to protect the airline passengers from a terrorist attack, it's also to protect us and protect passenger safety in general. TSA justified its decision by saying that it would allow the TSOs to move more quickly. However, when you put a limit now on what length of knife would be allowed, what the TSOs effectively become are NFL referees measuring first downs. You can imagine the scene. You have a knife coming through, the TSO can't determine how big it is, so he's got to take out the measuring tape, holding up a long line, preventing him from looking at liquids or other explosives and whether they could bring down an airline. And then he's got to declare if it's allowed or not. All the while, bags are still moving through to be screened. This would actually make it harder to detect liquids than make it easier, as the TSA had announced. Had the TSA meaningfully consulted with the stakeholders before announcing its proposal, these issues would have been addressed. But I do appreciate Administrator Pistol in his decision to put the policy on hold, to give more time for input, and I appreciate his decision today stating that he no longer will allow knives on boards. Our amendment reaffirms the current ban on knives on planes. It would prohibit the TSA from making the change it had proposed and now has backed away from. Our amendment is supported by a number of groups, including the Coalition of Flight Attendants Unions, International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers, International Brotherhood of Teamsters, Coalition of Airline Pilots Association, and American Federation of Government Employees. It's important that we pass this amendment today to show that the House stands with these groups and the flying public in rejecting knives on airplanes. I again want to thank my colleagues who are co-sponsors of this amendment, Mr. Grimm from New York, Mr. Markey, Mr. Cook, Ms. Jackson-Lee, and Mr. Reed. I appreciate their efforts, and I encourage all members to support our amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. For what purpose the gentlelady from Texas rise? Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
To the managers of this important legislation, to Judge Carter and to Mr. Price, thank you for working on what is an enormously important message and mission of our nation, and that is to secure America. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to work with the authorizers in Chairman McCall and Ranking Member Thompson, and to work with the Ranking Member and Chairperson of the Subcommittee on Transportation Security, Mr. Hudson and Mr. Richmond. Having just flown in from a memorial, and as members often do, and as we interact with our constituents, we know a lot about flying. And so it is very important that this amendment be taken as it has been offered. And I congratulate my co-sponsors, Mr. Grimm, Mr. Markey, Mr. Reed, Mr. Swalwell, and Mr. Cook, all of whom we have worked together with. For it is interesting that this has come to a point where today we can thank Administrator Pistol for his thoughtfulness in this process and the deliberations that took place, that the announcement comes that he too understands that allowing knives on planes is not the right decision. But in addition to the important statement of knives, we now know that other accessories, such as baseball bats and billiard cues and ski poles and hockey sticks and lacrosse sticks, among others, and golf clubs, likewise have been included in his statement. This amendment deals with knives. And the reason why this is very important, because we should reaffirm the fact, as a member of the Homeland Security Committee, and for many of us who started on this committee after the heinous tragedy of 9/11, many of us who went to Ground Zero during the recovery period, because of the horrific tragedy, smoke was still billowing from those terrible, tragic ashes. We too know what Homeland Security is. It is a promise to America to do everything we can to ensure the security of the homeland. And so it is important to take note of Administrator Pistol's very thoughtful concern, and that concern, of course, was the idea of security. This amendment will give comfort to the issue of security. We know there are issues of safety. We want to make sure that seat belts are on, and we want to make sure that seats work and bathroom doors work on a plane in flight. We want to make sure that passengers remain in seats during difficult weather. But security is an important question. And today, this amendment takes a stand for security. I am glad that after 9/11, we did have reinforced doors for the cockpit. We did have the ability of pilots to be trained and to be able to have weapons on board behind that cockpit, all in the name of security. Well, let me tell you that a knife that has been measured by the eye, that then is allowed to get on the plane, it can be a weapon against security. And today we are saying that we need to codify in law the idea that knives will never be allowed to be on planes. Human beings are in the cockpit, our very able pilots, and flight attendants and passengers, grandmas and family vacationers and college students and business persons, and our warriors, both wounded and not, and many others travel on airplanes, going home to loved ones, traveling to funerals, going for joyful occasions. And it is very clear that a knife can be a threat to security. It can be a threat to security because, in fact, even as our valiant flight attendants who have yet been given required flight training, flight attendant training, which we are continuing to work on, they will be the first to stand up against an individual attempting to take a plane or to be able to threaten all of the passengers, to create an insecure atmosphere. And who knows what pilots will be thinking of, will be required to do, Who knows what an unmanned, unair-marshaled plane, or even one with an air marshal, when there are a number of those who are on the flight with knives. And so I ask my colleagues to vote for security and vote for the Grimm, Markey, Jackson, Lee,
Time
Reed
the gentlelady has
amendment,
expired.
Swalwell and Cook amendment to keep knives off a plane.
Time
I
of the
yield back.
gentlelady has expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York. What purpose the gentleman from Texas rise?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I rise and I will announce that we will accept this amendment. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back to this time. The gentleman from North Carolina.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last words.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, neither am I going to object to this amendment, given the TSA's decision of this afternoon, a decision that has, I believe, made the amendment largely irrelevant. And I do want to express my appreciation for the concerns addressed here tonight by the sponsors of this amendment and the stakeholders that many of us have heard from. I want to take just a second, though, to underscore that TSA did not propose these changes haphazardly, that the proposal that is being attacked here tonight and that has been reversed here today by the agency, that proposal was the result of a risk-based approach to TSA's security requirements. Also remind the House that the current TSA administrator, Mr. Pistole, is a 26-year veteran of the FBI. I've been impressed by his willingness to stand by the data, stand by what objective analysis dictates, whether that means reconsidering a regulation or insisting that it remain in place. Since the International Civil Aviation Organization changed its standards to permit passengers to carry small pocket knives in 2010, more than 5 billion commercial airline passengers on flight originating outside the United States have traveled without incident. And I do think it's ironic, Mr. Chairman, that after all these years of members complaining about long wait times and passengers having to take off their shoes and their coats and their belts, but have to take out those laptops, take out those liquids, that TSA now does something to speed up security lines, and suddenly members want to reverse that decision on the floor of this House. I hope we are not going to get into the habit of overturning risk-based decisions, threat-based decisions on the floor of this House. But as I say, the amendment before us is now largely irrelevant, so I have no objection to its adoption. Now yield back.
This time, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York. As many as are in favor will signify by saying aye. Those opposed will say no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Amendments agreed to.
Chairman, I request the yeas and nays.
For what purpose the gentleman from Ohio rise?
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Ryan of Ohio. At the end of the bill, before the short title, insert the following. Section, none of the funds made available by this act may be used to pay the salary of any officer or employee of the Department of Homeland Security who approves any of the following petitions. 1. A Department of Homeland Security, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, Form I-130, petition for alien relative in a case in which Brazil is the beneficiary's place of birth as provided on such form. 2. A Department of Homeland Security, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, Form I-129F, petition for alien fiancé in the case in which Brazil is the alien fiancé's country of citizenship as provided on such form. 3. A Department of Homeland Security U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services Form I-140, immigration petition for alien worker in a case in which Brazil is a country of citizenship or country of nationality as provided on such form of the alien for whom the petition is being filed.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman will suspend. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This has been read. This doesn't allow petitions for relatives, fiancés, or workers coming from Brazil. And I first want to say thank you to Judge Carter, Chairman Carter, Mr. Price. We passed a very similar amendment out of the Appropriations Committee that was dinged here a little bit earlier. This is a narrowly tailored version of that. And I rise today not because I want to. Many of us come here because we want to offer amendments. I don't necessarily want to offer this amendment, but I'm offering this amendment on behalf of Major Carl Herrig. And I'd like to tell the House of Representatives a brief story about Carl, who flew 200 missions for our country in Iraq and Afghanistan. On March 10th of 2007, Major Carl Herrig's wife went out and bought a .357 Magnum and shot and went to a shooting range. She purchased ammo and asked, what ammo can I buy here that best kills? 2 days later, Claudia Herrig shot Major Carl Herrig in my congressional district. She fled to Brazil, where she was from, and she could not be extradited, so we were told, because we don't have a treaty with Brazil in order to extradite their citizens, which would make sense. But later, throughout the investigation, we found out that in August of 1999, Claudia Herrig renounced her Brazilian citizenship and said she was a citizen of the United States, which gives us every right to have her come back and extradited back to the United States. Now, this woman shot a war hero. She renounced her Brazilian citizenship, and she now is drinking rum runners in Rio de Janeiro, walking around freely in Brazil, while Carl Herrig's family is sitting in Newton Falls, Ohio, his brother, his parents, wondering why we can't bring this woman back into the United States for justice. Now, many people would say, well, why are you offering an amendment? Why are you trying to defund visas? Because I've been working on this since 2007. I've got a stack of letters here that go back to Alberto Gonzales. Now, many members of this Congress don't even know who he was. Condoleezza Rice, then Secretary Clinton, on and on and on to try to get the attention of people, and it takes an amendment in the Appropriations Committee to say we're not going to pay and be able to fund visas anymore. Now, I don't have any problem with Brazil. We've got a good relationship with them. But they have a woman who killed one of our airmen, who flew 200 missions to Iraq and Afghanistan. And you want to talk about a safe haven? If the kids from Boston, the Boston Massacre a few weeks back, instead of going to the 7-Eleven, they got on a flight and they went to Brazil, they'd be sitting in Brazil right now, and we wouldn't be able to get them back here. Now, I recognize that this is extraordinary actions, but there's a long process ahead before this bill becomes law. We've gotten the Brazilians' attention, and now it's time for us not to take the pressure off, but to allow this process to continue until Claudia Herrig is back in the United States and getting prosecuted in Trumbull County, Ohio. It should be known, too, to this House that Al-Qaeda is setting up shop in Brazil, planning attacks, training people in Brazil right now. I've got 2 articles, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit for the record here.
That's got to be done under general leave.
Then I won't submit them, Mr. Chairman. But Al-Qaeda is setting up in Brazil right now, and we have no mechanism. If someone would commit a terrorist act here in the United States, flee to Brazil, we would not be able to get them back. And I think this amendment sends a signal to the Brazilians, hopefully in the long term, to renegotiate treaties and the talk of extradition, but also in the short term to get Claudia Herrig back into the United States. And I would just like to end, Mr. Chairman, with a quote from Carl Herrig's dad, Ed Herrig. He said, our government is supposed to be the most powerful country in the world, and they're turning their back on a 25-year veteran. It's wrong. When you say the Pledge of Allegiance, the last sentence is, and justice for all. They are turning their back on my son's justice. Let's right this wrong, Mr. Chairman, and pass this amendment.
Time the gentleman has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia rise?
I rise to claim time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I must reluctantly rise and oppose this amendment. I do not want to minimize in the least the unacceptable nature of the present state of affairs, and I do not want to minimize in the least the brute fact that a murderer is presently escaping justice. And also, I don't want to minimize the service that this man gave to our country. As a chaplain in the Air Force, as a pastor for over 11 years, it has been unfortunately my duty on many occasions to have to deliver news of one who has either been killed in action or one who has died tragically. And by that, my heart bleeds and my heart hurts for this family. And in this situation, I commend my friend from across the aisle for his dedication to bringing this person to justice. And right now, there is the unescapable fact that there's a problem going on. However, the remedy proposed by the author of this amendment raises issues of such magnitude that they need to be resolved through regular order, through the Judiciary Committee's hearing and markup process. I personally pledge to work with Mr. Ryan to examine in the Judiciary Committee the issues of foreign nations' compliance with extradition requests. On behalf of Chairman Goodlatte, I pledge to examine the possibility of withdrawing the right of nationals of non-cooperating countries to enter the U.S. Certainly, our Crime Subcommittee has the expertise on the extradition issue, and the Immigration and Border Security Subcommittee has the expertise on immigration. This is not the first time we have faced such troubling issues. For instance, it is very often the case that foreign nations refuse to accept the return of their citizens who have been deported to the U.S. DHS's Office of the Inspector General reported that as of June 2004, more than 133,662 illegal aliens with or pending final orders of removal have been apprehended and released into the United States, unlikely to ever be repatriated if orders removed because of the unwillingness of their country of origin to provide the documents necessary for repatriation. Some of those aliens from countries such as China have gone on to kill Americans once released. Last Congress, the Judiciary Committee considered legislation by Mr. Poe that would have withheld temporary visas from nationals of countries that would not accept back their deported citizens. It is important to note that the legislation would have not just impacted a single foreign country, would have penalized all bad actors on an equal basis. I do need to mention that there is also humanitarian concerns with implementing this amendment. In 2012, over 11,000 Brazilians received green cards, immigrant visas. Among these Brazilians were 8,000 immediate relatives of U.S. citizens. These are spouses, minor children, and parents of U.S. citizens. So we just have to keep in mind that by enacting this amendment, we would be preventing thousands of U.S. citizens from reuniting with their Brazilian spouses, children, and parents. Again, it is with a hard state that I have to rise in opposition to this amendment. But for the reasons that I have stated, the good intentions of the gentleman from across the aisle do not override the larger concerns when dealing with this proposition and the issue of your amendment. And so with that, for these reasons I have set out, I must oppose this amendment, but I do look forward to working to resolve this distressing situation with the author. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana rise?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I stand in support of my colleague from Ohio, and part of being a legislator and part of having a responsibility of being elected to this body and representing people back at home is you have to use the tools that are in front of you to accomplish the goal that you need to accomplish. And so as we stress regular order and we talk about the Judiciary Committee, but right now, today, right here on the floor of this House, we have the ability as congressmen to make a difference. For a family whose hero was killed, and we know who the perpetrator is, and nothing's being done about it. So I would share my colleagues' frustration, and I would yield the remainder of my time to the gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you,
gentleman from Louisiana has to remain standing.
Thank the gentleman. I'm going to be brief. Again, I want to thank Chairman Carter. I want to thank Mr. Price. And just to say, I believe this is a homeland security issue. This is an appropriate venue for that. As the gentleman from Louisiana said, there's a level of frustration here because we have been working on this, pursuing regular order now since 2007, and we have gotten nowhere. And as I said, that this woman is walking around in Brazil a free woman when Carl Herrig is dead, and he flew almost 200 missions for our country. Now, this process has a long way to go. We're not anywhere close to this bill becoming law. We've got a lot of time between today and that day. So let's work today to try to increase the pressure, to try to get justice for Carl Herrig, and try to make this situation right. Again, I thank everyone. I don't want to be here offering this amendment because of the situation, but I promised this family I would do everything in my power to get justice for their son and to get this woman. And so help me God, I'm going to do everything I can to get this woman back here, and whether it's this bill or bills in the future. So I ask the members of this House to please, please, please support this amendment on behalf of Carl Herrig and his service to our country. And with that, I yield back to my friend from Louisiana.
I yield the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. What purpose does the gentleman from Arizona rise?
Mr. Speaker, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to commend the gentleman from Ohio for standing so strong for an American patriot. I believe his motives are extremely noble and good, but I don't believe this is the right way to handle it. I am the chairman of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee on Foreign Relations. Brazil comes under my purview. While we have points of trouble with all of our bilateral relationships, we don't necessarily throw the baby out with the bathwater. This is an extreme measure. It would punish a lot of very, very innocent people who my colleague spoke of right before me, innocent people that are trying to immigrate or come work or study in the United States from Brazil. And I want to commit to the gentleman from Ohio that as the chairman of the subcommittee over the Western Hemisphere, I will do everything within my power to work with him if it requires hearings, whatever it takes. I want to help you bring justice. I do not believe that this is the right way to do it. In fact, I think it would be very counterproductive in our relationship with Brazil, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Ohio. As many as are in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Gentleman from Ohio. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Ohio will be postponed. What purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana rise?
To propose an amendment.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 1, printed in the congressional record, offered by Mr. Cassidy of Louisiana.
The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized for 5 minutes.
Yes. Thank you. Briefly, the Bigger Waters Act was passed in order to make the flood insurance program both actuarially sound and functionally sound, and we hope that it is on the track to make it actuarially sound, but it is not functionally sound. So this attempts to address this. What this bill would do is Section 207, and only 207, it would not allow it to be implemented for 1 year. After that, it would begin to be implemented. Let me first say that the CBO has scored this at 0. It has no impact upon the Federal Treasury. Well, the reason to do this, though, is that FEMA does not yet have the methodology by which to implement this program. Indeed, there's a GAO report from 2008 which shows that FEMA's rate-setting process warrants attention. As it turns out, they haven't updated it since 2008, so their over 20-year methodology still does not apply. And as it turns out, families are being terribly affected. So there's one family in Louisiana which has never flooded and yet has a 6,000% increase in their premium. Clearly, this has grave implications for this family, but as it turns out, it's turned their whole real estate market upside down. People can't build, people can't sell. There is an uncertainty there created by the implementation of this particular section. Now, let me emphasize, this is only Section 207. All other sections continue, and the CBO score is 0. I knowing that others would like to comment upon this, I will then reserve the balance of my time and yield to, can I do that? Mr. Yeah, then I will yield back at this point. Okay.
Gentleman yields back his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana rise?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Back home, I've talked to thousands of my constituents and had thousands of my constituents talk back to me, scream back to me, cry in my arms because of the impact of this legislation. And right now what they're facing is a double whammy when it comes to flood insurance. They face the likelihood of higher rates and incorrect flood maps. FEMA has drafted new maps that completely ignore the facts on the ground. The maps disregard non-structural features like marshland and forests and our investment into restoring our coast. It also ignores the investment and sacrifices by locals to build their own levees. These communities are investing in their own safety, in their own security, and FEMA should recognize that. In many of these communities, like the west side of St. Charles Parish, the levees are more than 100 years old, and many of these communities have not flooded in 100 years. If that's not 100-year flood protection, I don't know what is. You see, for too long, the National Flood Insurance Program wasn't on stable footing. Since the last long-term authorization expired in 2008, we had to pass 9 short-term extensions. During that time, the program lapsed 5 times. The last time, in June of 2010, approximately 47,000 home sales were delayed or canceled. Due to the leadership of my colleague, Representative Waters, last July we passed the Biggert-Waters Flood Insurance Act. The bill put the program on stable footing for 5 years. But the rate increases FEMA has quoted are astronomical and unintended. Homeowners who played by the rules and built their homes according to the guidelines in place are being told that their insurance is going to go up hundreds of %. What's even more shocking is that many of these homes have never flooded. For instance, a homeowner in St. Charles Parish, Louisiana, who was paying $338 per year for flood insurance will now have to pay $23,000 per year with new maps. Another homeowner in the same town will go from $365 to $28,000 per year. If this stands, people will be forced to give up their homes, burdening the banks and killing the real estate markets. We cannot in good conscience stand here and let this law force people to give up their homes, to give up on the American dream, and destroy hard-working, tax-paying citizens. These taxpayers depended on and followed the rules and laws. We cannot turn our backs on them. I have a bill that will fix much of this without a score, and I'm proud that Rep. Waters and the entire Louisiana delegation have signed on. The home builders and the realtors support this amendment and my bill. But this amendment would give homeowners immediate relief. Therefore, I urge you to join me in supporting this amendment so that we can fix these issues while keeping the National Flood Insurance Program on sure footing and make sure that we don't leave hard-working families across the nation on their own. Because as we come here and do things in theory, a lot of times we miss what happens in reality and what's on the ground. And if we don't change this law, reality is going to set in and people are going to lose their homes, they won't be able to sell them, and we will create another disaster of national proportion with unintended consequences that we never tried to do. So I would just ask that we support my colleague in this amendment, and I'll yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia rise?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
You know, Mr. Chairman, this kind of reminds me of a story about a World War I veteran, Navy veteran, that went back home to Ware County where he loved to coon hunt. And this gentleman, being injured, got a wooden peg leg. But he took the boys and they went out and they got ready, and they were all around the campfire. It was kind of cool that night. They were waiting for the dogs to tree one, and so he got a little bit too close to the fire, and it burned about 8 inches off of this wooden peg. And so all of a sudden the hounds start baying, and he gets up and starts running, and he had ran about 20 yards. And he turned around and he said, "Watch out, boys, there's a hole every other step." There's some holes in what this amendment is trying to do. First of all, you've got to remember that this bill was just passed a year ago. And it was the Biggert Waters reform bill, where we're trying to reform the flood insurance program. And let me remind people that 406 members voted in favor of this. And every member that I see down here that is talking to try to relieve this voted for the bill. Everybody in the Louisiana delegation, everybody in the Mississippi delegation, everybody in the New York delegation with the exception of one, everybody in the New Jersey delegation, everybody in the Mississippi delegation voted for it. And this bill was passed by unanimous vote, both bipartisan, because everybody realized, especially in the effects of Katrina and others, where in 2005, before Katrina, they had a credit card limit of $1.5 billion. After Katrina, we raised that credit card limit $20 billion. After Sandy, we raised the credit limit another $10 billion. So right now we've got $30 billion on our credit card. And you know what? In 2017, that has to go back to $1 billion. And if you look at the amount of money that we've had to borrow to pay for this, and I voted for the $9.7 billion because it's an obligation that we had to the people that had flood insurance. That was an obligation that we have. But you know, the way most insurance works is that if you are at higher risk, you pay a higher premium. If for some reason my car keeps running into things accidentally, my car insurance is probably going to go up. And anybody that has extenuating circumstances, whether it's you're in a fire zone or whatever it is, your insurance rates are based on that. The difference is, unfortunately, that the government-run flood insurance programs does not require homeowners in flood-prone areas to pay for their fair share. In fact, premiums in flood-prone areas are so low that FEMA has needed a bailout, as I mentioned, 3 times in the last 8 years. Due to FEMA's failures, last year Congress passed a bipartisan Biggert Waters bill, insurance reform. It was supported, as I mentioned, by these delegations. This landmark 5-year authorization is something that even people here said, we need to do this. In fact, I will quote, "It is imperative that Congress act as quickly as possible to pass a 5-year extension of flood insurance so that policyholders can have some assurance moving forward." This is by one of the authors of the amendment. Section 207 does something that no other flood bill has done before. It says that homeowners in flood zones must pay an amount that accurately affect their risk of flooding. Notably, Congress recognized this section may place a burden on some homeowners in flood-prone areas. So to address this concern, Section 207 specifically stated that the rate increase must be phased in over 5 years, not to exceed a 20% increase each year. The outcome is common sense reforms that are supported by Republicans and Democrats alike that balance concerns of homeowners and taxpayers. Now, I'm no supporter of the government-mandated flood insurance, but these are bipartisan reforms that you don't often see passed in Washington. Let's don't back up. Let's keep going forward. The Biggert Waters Flood Insurance Reform Act was designed to get FEMA out of this constant bailout, but to be fair to people who experience frequent flooding. Importantly, this bipartisan reforms were enacted less than a year ago in the Financial Services Committee. We have not even held a hearing on the implementation. This does not need to be in an appropriations bill. It needs to go back to Financial Services and let us look at it.
Time of the gentleman has expired. For what purpose does the gentlelady from California rise?
Mr. Chair, I move to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of this amendment offered by the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Cassidy. I am pleased to say that my colleagues, Mr. Cassidy and Mr. Richmond and I, have worked to address this important issue in an ongoing bipartisan way. The National Flood Insurance Program was created in 1968 after record flooding led the private sector to abandon the flood insurance market and stop writing flood policies. The program is a key component of the federal government's efforts to minimize the damage and financial impact of floods. It is the only source of insurance against flood damage for most residents and provides much-needed coverage for 5.5 million homeowners and their families. This is why I worked across the aisle with my colleague, Representative Judy Biggert, to reauthorize this program. Before this reauthorization, the flood insurance program was plagued by repeated lapses in authority, placing many local communities at risk. During those lapses, FEMA was not able to write new policies, renew expiring policies, or increase coverage limits, causing great uncertainty for millions of homeowners who depend on the program's existence. The Biggert-Waters bill was instrumental in stabilizing the flood insurance program. It provided a 5-year reauthorization and made critical improvements to the program. The reforms in Biggert-Waters gave communities more input into flood maps and strengthened the financial position of the flood insurance program. In drafting this bill with then Chairwoman Judy Biggert, I sought to strike the right balance between protecting homeowners and strengthening the flood insurance program. This law was intended to reauthorize the flood insurance program in a sustainable way. The intent was not to impose punitive or unaffordable rate hikes that could make it difficult for some to remain in their homes. And you heard the testimony from Mr. Richmond about the incredible increases in the premium costs. This is why I am extremely concerned about reports that homeowners in certain areas are facing high and unsustainable flood insurance rates. I have committed to work with FEMA and with my colleagues here in Congress to address this unintended consequence of this otherwise helpful legislation. So I'm supporting the gentleman's amendment today. This would prohibit FEMA from using funds made available in this act to implement one provision from Biggert-Waters that has raised an unintended consequence and requires further study before being implemented. While the gentleman's amendment is a positive first step in addressing this issue, more needs to be done. Last month, my friend from Louisiana, Mr. Richmond, and I introduced H.R. 2199, the Flood Insurance Implementation Reform Act of 2013, a bill on which Mr. Cassidy is an original co-sponsor, that would make additional steps to provide meaningful relief and address the issue of affordability. The bill would delay implementation of changes to grandfathered rates, the subject of Mr. Cassidy's amendment, for 3 years instead of 1. It would also delay implementation of the rate changes that FEMA is currently ruling out. I look forward to continuing to work with my friends on both sides of the aisle to ensure that Biggert-Waters Act is implemented in a balanced way to ensure the flood insurance program's stability and affordability. FEMA's current implementation schedule would upset that delicate balance and unintentionally impact families and local communities. For these reasons, I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support 2199 and to also vote aye on this amendment. And let me just say to those who would represent that we all voted for it. So, since we voted for it and we worked together, we worked across the aisle, Democrats and Republicans working together, that somehow we can't make amends or changes that are desperately needed, working together. I think it is extremely important when you have Mr. Cassidy over there and you have Waters over here, one of the original authors of the bill, who are talking about something has happened, unintended consequences that have taken place that will cause homeowners to lose their homes. Now, it's easy if this does not happen in your communities or in your districts. But ladies and gentlemen, I want you to know that this is an interdependent business that we're in. And to the degree that we recognize other people's problems and we're willing to stand up and give support, particularly when it talks about home ownership, when it talks about that which is so important to all of us, that we should work together, and I would urge an aye vote.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina rise?
I'm going to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise today to speak against the amendment, and I think there's one thing that's gone overlooked in this debate so far, Mr. Chairman, which is not only was this provision in the bill originally in order to bring sustainability to the flood program, it was also designed to bring fairness to the flood program. What do I mean by that? Yes, the original bill was designed to raise flood rates on some people. It was also designed to lower them on other people. You heard the gentleman from Louisiana properly state that this amendment would have no score, have no impact on the CBO would have scored at 0, no impact on the deficit, no impact on spending. Absolutely true. The underlying language in the bill was scored the exact same way. When we passed this bill last year, that provision scored out at 0 because the CBO assumed on its own, it's not required by statute to do this, but it did this on its own, the CBO assumed that when rates went up on some people, they would go down on others. That seems to make a lot of sense, doesn't it, that we would have an insurance program that would actually charge folks more who are in riskier areas, but also seek to charge people less who are in less risky areas. I think it's important. It bears stating that if this amendment passes, yes, folks who live in high-risk areas will see lower premiums, but the folks who live in low-risk areas will see higher premiums. We have a chance here to bring some sanity to something in a government program. We have a chance to bring reason and rational thought to this government program by saying people who are in riskier areas should pay more. Are there protections there? Yes. Are they necessary? Absolutely. But at the end of the day, this program was designed to bring some sanity to this flood program, which is why so many people, myself included, voted for this originally. I think these are well-intentioned. I absolutely think they're well-intentioned. I disagree with the impression that these are unintended consequences. These are the exact intended consequences of the underlying bill, that we would simply charge folks who are in risky areas more. If you live 7 feet below sea level in New Orleans, your rates probably should go up. If you live 600 feet above someplace else, your rates probably should go down. I think it's important to know that, yes, there are people in my state who will pay more because of this district. There are also, because of this law. There are also people in my district who will pay less. And that will be turned on its ear if this amendment passes. So I would encourage us to consider that what we have done last year was accurate and correct and brought some much-needed sanity to this program. And with that, I yield the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman, to the gentleman from Georgia.
Gentleman from South Carolina has to remain standing. Gentleman from South Carolina has to remain on his feet.
Thank you, and I thank the gentleman for yielding. And let me just say that, you know, FEMA, this does not go into effect this year. So, you know, in fact, FEMA, the Louisiana FEMA, has been told not to give out these rates because they don't know. They've been trying to do a flood map for 30 years. Now, if we think a one-year extension is going to help them, you know, we're misleading ourselves. And in fact, from my legislative experience, when you extend it for 1 year, then you're asked to extend it again. Look at the student loans. We extended for 1 year. Now they want to extend it for 2 more. It's a constant extension. My experience has been most court cases are settled on the courthouse step when the pressure is put on both people to settle. I think that this is bringing to a head the fact that FEMA needs to get their act together along with the Corps and get these flood maps done. By us giving them another year extension, it's not going to do anything but delay us getting these updated maps for another year. I promise you, that's the way government works. And so we need to understand that on the one hand, we're saying, well, FEMA has given out all these new rates. It's going to go to $20,000 or whatever it is. But on the same hand, we're saying, hey, they don't have the capability of doing a flood map. You can't have it both ways. You know, either FEMA can do it or they can't do it. But we need to do this through the Financial Services Committee, where the ranking member, the gentlelady from California, was a big part of what we did in the bigger waters bill. And so why don't we take it and go back through financial services where this bill came from rather than trying to do it through an appropriations bill. That's the reason this process, you know, is so messed up here that we try to do things like this. So my concern is that this is the wrong place to try to amend this bill. We need to have hearings. We need to have oversight of FEMA and find out how the implementation of this bill is going and put the pressure on FEMA and the Corps to finally get these maps straightened out. But for somebody to have a home that's 7 feet below flood level and pay $329 a year in a premium doesn't make sense. I'll yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. What purpose does the gentleman from New York rise?
Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. And I rise today in support of the amendment offered by my friend and colleague, Mr. Cassidy. I'd also like to thank my colleagues across the aisle, Ms. Waters, Mr. Richmond, for their support. I do want to clarify one thing, because I think that the statement was made that it's not an unintended consequence for premiums to go up and go down, and that is true. But the unintended consequence that we're speaking